December 15th, 1914. Deep beneath the hills of Kyushu, Japan, thousands of men descended into the darkness before sunrise. Just like every other morning, they carried their lamps, their tools, and the unspoken hope of returning home for dinner. None of them could have imagined that within hours, the earth itself would turn against them. A single catastrophic explosion would tear through the tunnels of the Mitsubishi Hojyo Coal Mine, collapsing walls, igniting gases, and swallowing 687 human lives in one of the deadliest mining disasters the world had ever seen. This was not just an industrial accident. It was a tragedy born from ambition, neglect, and the ruthless hunger of an empire racing toward modernity. Stay with us, because every one of those 687 lives deserves to be remembered. To understand the Hojyo disaster, you must first understand what Japan was becoming in 1914. The country was in the grip of fierce industrialization. After centuries of isolation, Japan had burst onto the world stage, determined to rival the great Western powers in both military strength and economic output. At the heart of this transformation was energy, and energy meant coal. The island of Kyushu sat on some of the richest coal reserves in all of East Asia, and no company exploited those reserves more aggressively than Mitsubishi. By the early 1900s, Mitsubishi was not simply a company. It was a zaibatsu, a vast industrial empire that touched nearly every aspect of Japanese economic life. Shipbuilding, banking, mining, trade, all fell under its enormous shadow. The Hojyo Coal Mine was one of its crown jewels, producing thousands of tons of coal every month. But beneath the profits lay danger that no balance sheet could account for. The workers of Hojyo were not faceless numbers. They were fathers, brothers, and sons. Many from desperately poor, rural families who had come to Kyushu with nothing but their physical strength and a willingness to endure the dark. Mining in 1914. Japan was brutal work. Shifts lasted long hours, safety equipment was minimal, and the pay was barely enough to survive on. Workers wore simple cotton clothing, carried oil lamps, and navigated tunnels barely wide enough for two men to pass each other. Ventilation systems were primitive by any modern standard, and the deeper the tunnels went, the more lethal gases like methane accumulated in the rock. Supervisors pushed crews hard. Production quotas were non-negotiable. Complaints about unsafe conditions were often ignored or met with the threat of dismissal. These men had no union, no legal protection, and no voice. On the morning of December 15th, they went underground anyway, because they had no other choice. Before the explosion, there was silence, but that silence was deceptive. Beneath Hojyo, invisible and odorless, methane gas had been seeping from coal seams for years. In a deep mine, methane accumulates in pockets, sometimes small, sometimes enormous, just waiting for a single spark. Alongside methane, fine coal dust coated every surface of the tunnels. On its own, coal dust seems harmless, but when suspended in air and exposed to a flame or blast, it becomes something terrifying, a secondary explosive more powerful than the original trigger. Mining engineers of the era understood these risks in theory, but the reality inside Hojyo was that neither the methane levels nor the coal dust accumulation was being monitored with any serious rigor. Speed and output were the only metrics that truly mattered to the company. The warning signs were there: small gas flares, unexplained air pressure shifts, the nervous coughing of workers far underground. Nobody stopped the clock. Nobody ordered an evacuation. The disaster was being built, layer by invisible layer. At approximately 12:40 in the afternoon, the earth moved. A massive explosion erupted deep inside the Hojyo mine, sending a shockwave of fire and compressed air ripping through kilometers of underground tunnels. The blast was so powerful that the force blew men off their feet hundreds of meters from the epicenter. Roof timbers splintered, tunnel walls caved inward, oil lamps were extinguished, and then the darkness became absolute. Above ground, workers near the mine entrance felt the ground shudder beneath their feet. A column of black smoke and dust shot from the main shaft like a cannon. Those who had been near the surface scrambled out, coughing and bleeding. But for the hundreds working in the deepest sections, there was no escape route. The explosion had sealed them in, trapping them behind walls of collapsed rock, choking air, and fire. Rescue teams on the surface stared at the smoking shaft entrance, knowing that every passing second reduced the chances of finding anyone alive. The initial explosion was catastrophic enough, but what followed made it far worse. The blast ignited coal dust clouds throughout the tunnel network, creating a chain of secondary explosions that ripped through section after section of the mine. Fires broke out deep underground, fueled by exposed coal seams and broken timber supports. Toxic gases, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, afterdamp, flooded the tunnels in the explosion's wake. For any miner still alive after the initial blast, these gases were a death sentence. Afterdamp is particularly cruel. It is invisible, it has no smell, and it kills within minutes. Men who had survived the shockwave, who had crawled through rubble looking for an exit, simply fell asleep and never woke up. Tunnel after tunnel became a sealed tomb. The structural collapse made reaching survivors nearly impossible. Every step rescue teams took risked triggering further cave-ins. The mine was not just broken, it was actively hostile to anyone who tried to enter it. Despite the overwhelming danger, rescue workers didn't hesitate. Teams of brave men, some of them off-duty miners, some emergency responders, some simply volunteers from the surrounding village, began descending into the ruined shafts within hours of the explosion. The conditions they faced were almost incomprehensible. Temperatures underground had soared from the fires. Oxygen levels were dangerously low. Debris blocked almost every passage. The rescuers worked without modern breathing apparatus, relying on damp cloths tied over their noses and mouths. Some were overcome by gas and had to be carried back to the surface. Yet they kept going back down. They dragged injured men through collapsed corridors. They called out names in the darkness. Some survivors were found alive, delirious and barely breathing, hours after the explosion. But as the hours turned into a day, and then 2 days, the rescuers were forced to face a heartbreaking reality. The deeper sections of the mine had become permanently inaccessible. The men down there were gone. When the final count was completed, the numbers were almost impossible to absorb. 687 workers had lost their lives in the Hojyo mine disaster, making it one of the single deadliest mining accidents in human history up to that point. The dead ranged in age from teenage laborers to men in their 50s. Many were the sole breadwinners of their families. Some came from the same village, meaning entire communities were devastated in a single afternoon. The bodies that could be recovered were returned to grieving families. Many others were never retrieved. They remain entombed beneath Kyushu to this day. The surrounding towns fell into a quiet, collective grief that had no name. Widows with no income, children with no fathers, parents who had outlived their sons. The human wreckage left behind extended far beyond the mine itself. Mitsubishi faced no criminal prosecution. The company paid minimal compensation. Japan mourned briefly and then continued producing coal. The Hojyo disaster did not happen because of bad luck. It happened because of systemic, willful negligence. Investigations following the explosion revealed what many workers had already known, that safety measures inside the mine were dangerously inadequate. Gas monitoring was inconsistent. Ventilation systems were insufficient for the depth and scale of operations. The use of open-flame lamps in methane-prone tunnels was a practice that more cautious mining operations had already abandoned elsewhere in the world. At a corporate level, the drive for maximum coal output had overridden every safety consideration. Quotas were increased year after year without corresponding investment in safety infrastructure. Workers who raised concerns were silenced. Supervisors who might have slowed production to address hazards were themselves under pressure from above. The disaster was not a freak accident. It was the logical, inevitable outcome of running a dangerous industrial operation with no meaningful accountability. In 1914, Japan, the law provided no real protection for mine workers. Profit had no ceiling, but human life had no floor. The Hojyo disaster was not unique in the world of early 20th century mining. The same story, men sent underground into poorly ventilated gas-filled tunnels with minimal protection in service of industrial empires, was playing out across the globe. In Wales, in Pennsylvania, in South Africa, and in the mines of northern France, the pattern was tragically consistent. Companies maximized production. Governments looked the other way. Workers absorbed all the risk. The Courrières disaster in France in 1906 had killed over 1,000 miners. The Monongah disaster in West Virginia in 1907 had taken at least 360 lives. The Banner Mine disaster in Alabama in 1911 added more. Hojyo was the latest entry in a grim global ledger. Each disaster temporarily shocked the public. Each generated promises of reform, and then the mines reopened, quotas were restored, and the conditions that had caused the tragedy gradually crept back. It would take decades of labor activism, legislative change, and further catastrophes before genuine safety culture would take root in industrial mining worldwide. Among the 687 who died, a smaller number survived, and their accounts offer haunting glimpses into what those underground hours were truly like. Some survivors described being thrown off their feet by a wall of hot air that extinguished every lamp at once. The darkness that followed was total and disorienting. Men who had worked in those tunnels for years suddenly had no sense of direction. Some crawled toward where they believed the exit was, only to find a wall of collapsed rock. Others described the strange silence after the initial explosion. A silence broken only by distant groaning from the earth, the sound of fires crackling far away, and the faint cries of men who would not survive much longer. Those who made it out often did so by chance, being positioned near a shaft, or finding a pocket of breathable air in a side tunnel. Survival was not a matter of skill or bravery. It was almost entirely luck. The survivors carried the weight of that luck for the rest of their lives, never fully reconciling why they had been chosen, while so many others had not. The Hojyo disaster did eventually contribute to a slow, painful shift in Japanese mining law and labor policy. Public outcry following the explosion pressured the government to revisit safety regulations in the coal industry. New guidelines were introduced requiring improved ventilation standards and more rigorous gas monitoring. Compensation frameworks for mining families were cautiously expanded, but real structural change was painfully slow. Mitsubishi continued operating its mines with enormous profit margins. Japanese labor law remained weak compared to European standards. The coal industry continued to prioritize output above all else for decades to come. The deeper legacy of Hojyo is this: it proved that disasters of this scale are not natural events. They are manufactured by choices made in boardrooms, in government offices, and in the silent spaces where accountability should exist, but does not. Every mine that has collapsed, every shaft that has exploded, carries within it the same invisible architecture of neglect that destroyed Hojyo in 1914. 111 years have passed since the Earth swallowed 687 men at Hojyo. Most of the world has never heard their names. No Hollywood film has been made about them. No international memorial marks the date. They were coal miners in a country racing toward empire, expendable in life, forgotten in death. But they deserve better than silence. Each of those 687 men had a morning routine, a favorite meal, a person waiting for them at home. They had fears and dreams and small joys. They were not statistics. They were human beings who were placed into an environment that their employers knew was dangerous and sent down anyway, because coal was more valuable than their lives. If there is one thing their story asks of us, it is this: never allow the cost of human life to be treated as a line item on a balance sheet. Remember Hojyo. Remember the 687. And the next time the world asks how much a worker's safety is worth, remember what happens when the answer is not enough.